Hi, I'm Matt Diaz, the Director of Communications here at the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless, and you're watching the 2022 Policy Agenda Breakdown. Today we'll be talking about the policies and programs that MCH will be supporting this legislative session in the effort to end homelessness. And as you can imagine, we have a lot of ground to cover. So, let's get started. Now, the first question you might have is, where did these agenda items come from anyway? It's a good question with a simple answer. We went right to the source. MCH held listening sessions with people who have lived experience with homelessness, direct service providers, and advocates when deciding on our agenda items. With that out of the way, it's time to talk about the overall theme for the 2022 policy agenda. Or as I like to say, what's the big idea? So in 2022, the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless wanted to take a holistic approach in our policy agenda, specifically in supporting legislation that provides resources to people experiencing homelessness throughout the entirety of their journey to finding a permanent home. MCH decided to do this because of one specific idea that's been popping up a lot during our internal conversations and our listening sessions. Whether an individual or family is experiencing homelessness or transitioning into permanent housing, every Minnesotan deserves safety and dignity every step of the way on their journey to find home. And with that, let's get into our policy agenda items for the 2022 legislative session, starting with the Task Force on Shelter. The Task Force on Shelter is made up of community leaders, including people who've experienced homelessness and other stakeholders. They were established to make recommendations to strengthen the shelter system and provide services to people in need. MCH supports the Task Force on Shelter to lift up voices of people with lived experience and center them in decision-making. Next up, MCH is advocating for $100 million in shelter capital resources. MCH has identified over $100 million in shelter capital needs throughout Minnesota that'll create or preserve over 2,000 shelter beds. MCH is also advocating to create shelter infrastructure bonds, also known as SIBs, that will provide the funds to expand, preserve, and rehabilitate shelter beds to create temporary housing for people experiencing homelessness. MCH is supporting this because we know that funding the preservation and construction of shelter is key to providing safe and dignified spaces for people experiencing homelessness all across the state. Shelter models that are culturally specific, serve the LGBTQ community, and are low barrier are needed in order to address gaps in the shelter system. Next up, MCH is advocating for $95 million spread out over the next 3 years for the Emergency Services Program. Now, the Emergency Services Program, which you'll often hear referred to as just ESP, allows orgs and local communities to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness by providing funding that supports the operations, staffing, and resources to support families, individuals, and seniors. MCH supports this because we know that additional funding to ESP will have an impact statewide and empower communities to find creative, flexible solutions that address homelessness. Next up, MCH is supporting a $9 million budget increase for the Transitional Housing Program. The Transitional Housing Program, also known as THP, funds temporary housing and support services for individuals and families experiencing homelessness as they prepare to transition to long-term housing stability. Due to the lack of affordable housing available in Minnesota, we also propose extending the time limit of support from 24 to 36 months. MCH believes that extending the time limits on THP will allow people experiencing homelessness to establish stability, attain resources, and find a permanent and dignified home. Last but certainly not least, we're advocating for $500 million in bonds for homes. A $400 million investment in housing infrastructure bonds to develop affordable homes and a $100 million investment in general obligation bonds for public housing rehabilitation will create and expand housing options, cultivate long-term stability, and guarantee that everyone in our community has a permanent place to call home. MCH knows that shelter saves lives and housing ends homelessness. Because of this, the rehabilitation of public housing and the construction of more affordable homes is critical to ending homelessness in Minnesota. Well, now you're all up to date on MCH's 2022 policy agenda. We're really excited to be advocating for these programs, and we hope that you'll be lending us your support during this legislative session. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our Director of Public Policy, Zach Eichten, at zach@mnhomelesscoalition.org. Also, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to stay updated on what we're up to. You can find all those links and more in the description below. Once again, this is Matt Diaz from MCH saying thank you for your time, and as always, please remember, shelter saves lives and housing ends homelessness.